This is the Average Guy Network, and you have found Cyber Frontiers, show number 66, recorded on March 16th, 2022. Here on Cyber Frontiers, we explore cybersecurity, big data, and the technologies that are shaping the future. If you have questions, comments, or contributions, you can always contact us. If you'd like Christian to talk about something, actually, point that way. You can always send us an email, jim@theaverageguy.tv. You can contact the Christian directly if you want, christian@theaverageguy.tv. Find me on Twitter @jcollison. And of course, Christian is @BorgWhisper. Don't forget that theaverageguy.tv, powered by Maple Grove Partners. Get secure, reliable, high-speed hosting from people that you know and you trust, and some fantastic stuff. Of course, theaverageguy.tv, powered that way. MapleGrovePartners.com. Plans start as little as $10 a month. Christian, we did 2 of these in 2 months. We've set a new record. Welcome back.
Yeah, great to be back. I feel like we managed to zoom through 2021 fairly in a strange, quick way the last time. So I'm glad we're able to now start from current timestamp and continue the conversation.
We have a guest with us tonight. Ashton Webster is with us, and Ashton is a longtime friend of the show. He's been on several times in the past. All 3 of us, I think, at some point in time, worked together at Gallup. And Ashton, great to see you back, and welcome back.
Yeah, good to see you guys. I have to look back and see what the last number Cyber Frontiers I was on.
Yeah, listen, it's been a while for us too. We skipped 18 months in the process and have been kind of bringing it back. So I'm sure it's been a while. I thought I'd seen you like a year ago, and it was probably like 4 years ago.
It doesn't feel that long ago, actually.
No, it doesn't. Well, great to have you back, Ashton. Why don't you just give us a quick, if it's all right, Christian, give us a quick update on where you're at and what you're doing.
Sure. So I work at Capital One. I'm a software engineer there. I've been there for about 4 years now, and I work on their. I worked on a couple teams in their like retail bank department, which kind of with a focus on fraud detection and prevention. So they have a couple of different, for like every different type of money movement that you can imagine that's not credit card. We try to have systems and models that detect and prevent fraud there. So that's what I've worked on the last couple of years there. And outside of that, just like to read and play chess, and sometimes Christian will join me on that. So
well, great.
Yeah, tonight's show all started because there was a potential chess tournament brewing on the virtual interwebs. So.
Oh, nice.
Also, one other thing I probably should mention is there is a dog sleeping right here, and she might get up and crawl behind me at some point, or just bark randomly, because sometimes she does that. So
just mute. If she does start barking, just mute, and that's perfectly okay. It's the new world. There's all those kinds of things have happened, and you just push past them. So, Ashton, thanks for coming out tonight. Appreciate it.
Sure.
Christian, why don't you get us started? I think you've got a topic to get us rolling on tonight. What do you have for us?
Yeah, just really a warm-up topic and update as we follow just cybersecurity in the news. Biden signed in the last 24 hours of us recording this show on March 16th, the government funding bill, and attached in that government funding bill was a rider piece of legislation that had attempted to be attached in a previous funding bill and was ultimately scrapped. But they were able to get past this time the Strengthening American Cybersecurity Act. And so this act, one of the primary callouts, it mandates that any company that is considered part of critical infrastructure would be required now to report to Department of Homeland Security's, Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, known as CISA, within 72 hours of a data breach or within 24 hours of paying ransom on a ransomware attack. More interesting is that it adds a legal lever and mechanism that didn't exist previously as an authority for CISA, where if companies fail to comply with providing cyber incident reporting of this nature, CISA actually has subpoena power now to go discover data and records that would pertain to a company's failure to disclose a cyber incident as critical infrastructure. So I thought that was pretty interesting. We talk a lot about on the show both information disclosure and sharing, as well as just cyber intelligence and sharing. And I thought it was pretty notable that this legislation kind of slipped into the funding bill without much ado about nothing. It was fairly quiet in the news stream this week.
Christian, what do you think that changes when we think of the landscape of, it seems like we're always talking about a breach of some kind all over the place, right? Last episode, we kind of recapped the last part of 2020 and 2021, and there were a lot of, it seems like there's more than there's ever been. What do you think? What does this change practically from a posturing standpoint? And that's probably not the right way to say it, but for organizations, what are they going to have to do differently now that they didn't do before?
Yeah, and we even talked about it a little bit in the last show. I think there's going to be increased onus across business sizes to think of the cybersecurity incident plans and disaster recovery plans as major, administrative pieces of any company, right? Typically, these were nice to haves. They're increasingly becoming mandatory. For a long time, they were mandatory for what we would consider the big players, the big C corps, the big government agencies. Now we're starting to see those levers and mechanisms get even stronger in other big players. I'd consider critical infrastructure to be a fairly big player, right? Your electric, your gas, your oil industry, your energy sector, critical infrastructure. But I think this is going to continue to funnel down at state and local level as well. So I expect to see a continuing emergence of what I just call legal mechanisms or legislative levers by which companies will be held to a higher standard when it comes to either disclosure related to data breaches, which has been around for a while, but that's typically like loss of information of a customer, et cetera. This is really actually getting, I think, another layer deeper, more into just any kind of cybersecurity related concern is not going to be able to fly under the radar the way it might have been a company's discretionary choice 10 years ago to make that kind of call.
Christian, do you think with that flying under the radar you're saying, and maybe these companies weren't making the investment they needed to make to get compliant or to get to be able to defend better with this additional sunlight? Do you think that'll change funding for them, or they'll have to fund these initiatives more to make sure they're able to respond in the way that they have to now?
Well, it's kind of twofold, right? With more information coming into agencies like CISA, they're going to need to continue to staff incident response teams and folks that can deal with that kind of data coming in. So I do think that there's some kind of hiring and growth factor there. I absolutely think there's probably for larger companies, easier to do that, right? To scale up or down both compliance related individuals as well as engineering related individuals who would be relevant to this discussion. I think it's much harder to do at a small business level to check all of these boxes and kind of have your compliance portfolio together, so to speak, especially when you're starting out. So they're actually, one of the things I think could come out of this is a subculture industry in and of itself. What I mean by that is, much like many Americans choose to have their taxes prepared because they don't want to make a mistake on a 50-page form due every year, they outsource that and pay a fee and have someone take care of it. I really see a lot of small businesses going that way, right? Just like an LLC might retain legal counsel for being incorporated and basic kind of administrative stuff. I see this type of growing legal requirements being something that small businesses are going to seek third-party relief to help them be in compliance with the law.
Mm-hmm. When we say critical infrastructure, what does that kind of include, just for the average guy listening to this? What are those? Just give me an example of what those fits into that area.
Yeah, actually, it's funny because I first learned about these when the shutdown happened in some respects, where they had very specifically listed which companies and which sectors were considered both essential workforce. I'm sure everyone's familiar with that term. That was a keyword of 2020. Um, when we talk about critical infrastructure, we're really talking about a ranging set of things from um, what I call the class of industrial control system based companies: oil, electric, natural gas, heating, etc. Um, Critical infrastructure as a larger workforce also comprises anything from communication sector, defense industrial base, critical manufacturing, even food and agriculture. We When you actually look at um, what they're defining as critical infrastructure operators, I think that's going to be a smaller subset of folks than the larger, like, what are the sectors of the essential workforce. But you can be guaranteed, like, the think of it as utility companies at the bare minimum for what would fall in scope for this new power and authority that CISA will have.
Ashton, I'm going to ask you to weigh in on this. Before we do, since you're joining us, it's been a while since you joined us. I will say your opinions are your own, and you don't represent your employer in any of these. We have to be very. I don't know if there's any other disclosures that you need to make on that. We need to be careful about that these days as you're speaking. But Ashton, as you're looking at this, as you're looking at this bill, this new regulatory requirement, I know you spent a lot of time studying this when you're in school and some work. Anything you want to add to it?
To be honest, I'm not super familiar with this, but I was curious. I guess I'm going to kind of turn this around on Christian, but
Yeah.
When you mentioned like utilities, I wonder if included in there would be like the data utilities and meaning like the internet infrastructure. Like, would that also fall under there? And I guess when you said that, I was thinking like power and water and like those sort of things. But do you know if that would also include like your 5G network or even your like internet networks?
Yeah, right on. So, like, water is a great example of something that's considered part of that critical infrastructure definition. That's a good utility to call out. That wasn't in my example rap sheet. Something like your internet service provider or your 5G um, it is considered part of that essential workforce sector definitions that CISA has. I don't believe it is part of the actual definition that is defined as critical infrastructure. So they have a whole communications sector that would span 5G, internet service providers, et cetera. At least my understanding and what's come out so far is that's not in scope for this, but um, we'll need to sharpen our pencils and confirm that in the show notes, and maybe provide the actual list that came in the scope with this legislation.
It's like with any new legislation that's coming out, it takes a while to flush all this out to figure out what is, what isn't. Rules have to be made. There'll be additional committees and groups that are put together to kind of, to begin to say, okay, what does this mean? Christian, in your opinion, does this strengthen? Is this do you see this leading to better outcomes from a cybersecurity perspective? Does this make us better in being able to ransomware has just become a gigantic problem? Does this make us better?
It's interesting. I think it makes us faster in some respects. It also helps us collect data to be better in the future. And what I mean by that is, um, the more data a central kind of clearinghouse, so to speak, um, like CISA as an agency can, study this data that they collect and the trends over folks who are experiencing ransomware. It can help us get better at how to defend. I think for a while, though, it's just going to help us get better at incident response, right? Especially because there are things that CISA and other stakeholders can do to help provide incident response capabilities that may extend beyond what the company as a individual entity is prepared to handle, right? So I do think it helps us get better. It helps us respond a little bit faster. I'm not certain that I'm not certain that it's going to, um, fundamentally, create a dramatic improvement in just this actual security posture. I still think, design patterns and reference architectures and, companies following better compliance guidelines, that's important. That's, I think, more of a focus to plugging the leaking hole than the reporting aspect. But I do think the reporting aspect is definitely something that matters when it comes to, how are you dealing with your, overall incident response, which, once it happens, it's like, yeah, you want to be as prepared as possible to minimize the damage to the institution as you possibly can.
Christian, with all that's, oh, go ahead, Ashton.
Sorry, I was just going to piggyback on one thing on that. Do you think that this will also give like an opportunity for some like retrospectives on past incidents, or like having this repository of breaches that are being reported to CISA? Will that, like, I'm hoping, my take on it is hopefully they would like use that data to say, how can we prevent this going forward? Or like, these are the common types of vulnerabilities we're seeing that can be remediated in this way. I don't know, just interested in your thoughts on that.
Yeah, no, right on. I think it does. It absolutely, the aggregation of that kind of data and the ability for cyber defenders and, cyber analysts to study historical data is super helpful in understanding like where did it go wrong. And there's obviously a lot of raw data that isn't something that you're going to get from summary level information or from, non-standardized reporting. So, um, I think that yes, in short, um, we're going to see the ability for, you know, I think of CISA in many respects as a centralized clearinghouse for being able to do that. Over time, um, over time, CISA has really matured both in its capability to provide um, and play that role, as well as help proactively defend threats. And they're a big part of the flip side of it, right? Which is proactively telling companies and organizations when there is a cyber threat or a APT or a 0-day or a new vulnerability disclosure that companies need to be concerned with. They're able to rapid fire get that key information out to organizations that can act on it. I think this only helps them kind of fine tune that capability as we move forward.
Christian, in the article, it says that the measure becoming law is a complete reversal from only a few months ago, when it's stripped from the annual defense policy bill. Do you think it's March 2022? If you're listening to this in real time or even months from now, we kind of all know what's going on. Is this a little bit of a response to that? Do you think of some of the tension and potential conflict that's going on in Europe?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Right. So we've seen a lot of headlines about different cyber threat actors and different things to be concerned with just globally in response to the Russia-Ukraine conflict. And certainly the CISA legislation here is very on the top of mind of legislators who are worried about the cybersecurity posture in the defense. So from that perspective, yeah, very, very well aligned and inspired to the increased volume of cyber threat adversaries that we're seeing globally, right? We've seen a lot of news reporting around attacks to banks, critical infrastructure, information disclosure and leakage. So this fits very well into some of the global geopolitical conflicts and the cyber digital twin, so to speak, of what's happening in the physical world. So.
Ashton, any questions for Christian on this? I mean, I think we've done a pretty good job of covering it. Any other questions you want to ask?
No, yeah, I'm going to be honest. I didn't know about this until Christian brought it up, so
Yeah.
it's definitely an interesting step, though. I kind of hope this also gives some transparency on like just having that accountability of having to report when there is a breach and do so in specific timelines will hopefully motivate the right kind of behaviors going forward to prevent.
Yeah.
So like not try and sweep it under the rug.
Well, I think what's interesting is it's probably, of many of the breaches that we have seen over the last couple of years in those organizations necessarily wouldn't fit into this category. So you kind of think, well, okay, so it's not really fixing that. But to what you just said, Ashton, is I think it can set a precedent that hopefully will make its way downstream that will get some more accountability on in some of these areas to just make sure that we don't have bad actors, or we don't, I think Christian's words, organizations trying to sweep it under the carpet to say, well, I mean, if we just ignore it, we won't have to. And yet it continues just to happen more and more. And it's just, we've got to it's getting worse, not better. It's seemingly, that's my pedestrian view.
Yeah.
So, Christian.
Well, and to that end, it kind of segues into kind of one of the things I really wanted to pick Ashton's brain about tonight is, being in the financial services sector and industry. We talk about data breaches and some of these, other thematic headlines always seeming to be the next thing and the next thing and the next thing. And historically, my credit card's been, hacked, or, what's this unexpected $1,000 charge, or why do I have 3 orders of Nikes in my credit card statement? Like, what is your 50,000-foot view, Ashton, of where the industry was, let's say 3 to 5 years ago, with being able to handle financial fraud, just as a general category? And what are some of the technologies and capabilities that have improved where we are with fraud detection today, and keeping people's financial livelihoods, for lack of a better word, in a secure and healthy place?
I think I've definitely seen like a trend towards having. I think even like 3 to 5 years ago, there was artificial intelligence and machine learning models that were assisting with this, but I think those have just taken in so many more different types of features, and I think like on a lot of like it's not so hard to build the models. It's just to get all that data in a way that's actually usable. So I think that's one big step that I've kind of noticed even within like my experience at Capital One, is just seeing like having the ability to access all these different categories of data that are coming from different parts of the company and also outside of the company, like integrating things. For example, Zell, there are data sets like provided by that network and information provided by that network that can be useful for detecting fraud. So having that sort of trend towards more usable data within the company that's like trending towards being usable in these models, and also outside of the company being able to pull that in. I think that's one direction. I think that's making things at least like significantly improving the models. Another sort of trend I think is hopefully it's like going forward. I think there's like a desire to kind of be less reactive and more proactive. It's a tricky one. I think just like more and more, what I've seen a lot is like some fraud ring happens for a specific type of transaction, whether it's ACH or whether it's a certain check deposit or something like that. And in response to that, we make a rule or something to just prevent that one specific thing. And then the fraudsters figure out some other way to do it that's slightly different, or it's like just below the threshold or whatever it is. So I think that's like one area where, at least going forward, it's probably an issue 5 years ago. It's an issue now, but going forward, trying to kind of break that cycle and see things that are like in advance, either targeting areas that could be vulnerable before they happen, or just setting more sort of general rules that don't don't get into this like cat and mouse chase as much. But it's totally possible in 5 years. There's still things like that are going to happen. But I think that's one area that a lot of banks are facing right now, challenges in.
And I guess help us understand, and at least help me understand, like when you are working with a partner like Zelle or any of the other kind of financial technology capabilities that banks are integrating with, are there any common data formats or standards by which fraud or threat information is being shared between these companies in order to defend people's financial data? We've talked about how, more broadly speaking, like we just aforementioned topic about how companies have to do some type of standard reporting and disclosure to CISA in the case of critical infrastructure. Is there any kind of standard model or framework by which the financial sectors and industry are sharing the necessary threat intelligence in order to improve the fraud detection and response times to these types of scams?
Yeah, to be honest, I'm not going to be able to give you a very good answer to that one. I'm just not that tied into those specific like broader networks, if there are those that are sharing those data. I think for Zelle, I know that at least recently we had started to like tie into I believe it's called Zelle fraud indicators. So there is some either like API or data set that's available to give information about potential fraud on Zelle, and I think I hope to see, like, as a trend, more sharing of data and more standardization on consuming that, so that if there is potentially an issue affecting multiple banks, they kind of can share that among them rather than making it like a kind of competitive advantage to be able to handle it. So I don't know what the trend is going to be, whether it's going to be like we don't want to. I mean, think like if there's no regulation, it's going to probably be like we don't want to share exactly what we're doing because it's a competitive advantage that we're not as impacted by these fraud rings. So I think it'd have to be kind of like at a regulation level. They'd have to enforce that. I'm not sure what's already there, if anything, or what the direction is going to be, but that's just kind of
Ashton, Christian, really quick, for those that don't know what Zelle is, can you tell what is that? Is it a broker between banks to transfer money? Can you talk a little bit about that?
So it's basically like instant funds transfer between two bank accounts with a network of, like, basically banks participate in this network that is hosted by the third party. I think Zelle is its own company or organization that's kind of like separate from the banks. And banks participate in it to make it easy to transfer money between accounts. And its selling point, you can't send a lot of money on it. I think you can. Most banks, the maximum is like 2,000 to 2,500 around there per day, and then they might have monthly limits as well. But it's nice, like if you are paying back. Like I use it a lot for you're out with friends for drinks or food or something, and you just want to pay somebody like $20 or something like that. It's really easy because it goes directly from your account to their account. And it just happens within like a couple of seconds. But it's a little different than like ACH or that's the automated clearinghouse, where there is like kind of a third party where the money stays for a day or two, and then you can do much larger amounts, but you might use this more for like paying your rent. So it's you kind of have different tools for different jobs. This one's probably best fit for like a replacement for Zelle or a replacement for Venmo or PayPal if you just have like small amounts moving from person to person.
Okay.
How would you compare and contrast Zelle to something like Venmo?
I think one difference is for Venmo, you kind of have. I think they now have, if you're like, you have to categorize yourself as either a storefront or a person, right? Like they now have fees for if you're using it to kind of circumvent like normal routes of paying for things as a storefront.
I think that's pretty new too. I think that just recently kicked in. Yeah.
Yeah, it's definitely intended only for like peer-to-peer payments. So to be honest, I don't know all the like nitty-gritty details between the two, but it's the one nice thing about it actually is that it tends to be built into the bank accounts, like the bank apps or website or whatever itself. So you don't have to install this third-party application. You don't install Venmo. You just go to the app and kick it off from there, from your account to their account. And it's also set up so that they have it, if they, you opt into it. So when you set up the account or at any time after you have the account, for checking accounts, you would say, yeah, I do want to participate in Zelle, and it ties it to either your phone number or your email or both. And then when you want to send it to somebody, that's all you need. You just put in their email or their phone, and it says, this person's name, according to the account, is Christian Johnson. Is this correct? And then you make the payment that way. So those are kind of one advantage of Zelle over PayPal or Venmo, is that it's just like all within the banks. You don't need a third-party app or third-party account to do these transfers. That's actually one big reason I like it, is I also don't really necessarily trust PayPal or Venmo or just like, I don't want another place where I have to enter in my bank account number. So it's kind of one less. I mean, I guess it's still going to go through Zelle ultimately, but at least I don't have to have another password and username combination.
Sure. Talk to us a little bit about not necessarily the data aspects. Like, so we touched on how data and ML is still kind of a little bit of a cat and mouse game with trying to anticipate fraud, but talk about some of the security controls and protections that have changed in the last 5 years with respect to just securing financial transactions, right? So like, for example, as a Capital One customer, if I go to a gas pump that it doesn't recognize as a normal gas pump for me, I'm probably going to get a text message saying, "Hey, was that you?" How has that evolved over the last few years, and where do you see it going?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think it's a heck of a lot more advanced than it was 5 years ago. I think so. You're saying like when to just like verify whether transactions are potentially fraudulent?
I mean, yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's one use case, right? But there are so many schemes today that involve identifying whether or not you are really the person doing that thing, right? Everything from like people losing their homes because someone performs title theft, and they perform title theft by convincing a bank or lender that you are you, leveraging the money out of your house, and then the next thing you know, you have a loan in your name for the full value of your house. That's obviously a very extreme example, but it's kind of the same fundamental concept, right? Like, how has the finance technology gotten better at detecting that you as the person are really taking these actions on behalf of your money in a secure way, when you're not always walking into a physical bank and performing a transaction?
Yeah, to be honest, I haven't really touched on that as much in my role and just like the things that I've worked on. So I'll answer like a slightly different question, which is not what you asked, but where I have seen like dramatic change. Kind of like the other side of that is, so there are like so many advanced tools and models and rules that are really good at identifying whether it's you or not when you're making a transaction, or just whether a transaction is fraudulent. But what I have seen a big change in is how those are like managed and deployed, and just how they're managed at the code and infrastructure level. I think that has, in a lot of companies, and based on what I've seen, it's like dramatically changed in terms of the scans, the company regulations, the process for that, so that it's very, very just like, it's a totally different experience than it was. It's sort of like the Wild West, where you could just get away with deploying anything as long as it ran a couple of years ago. I mean, I haven't been, in the grand scheme of things, I haven't been a professional software engineer for that long, but my experience, 4 or 5 years ago is totally different than what it is now. Just in terms of how many different steps and checks that are performed and should be performed on the code to ensure that it's not deploying vulnerabilities or even just bugs and things like that. So seeing like that, if you've heard the shifting left of cybersecurity scanning, meaning don't run the scans right before, or even once it's already deployed, or after it's deployed, like checking that there's vulnerabilities or viruses or whatever. Run it before you even check in the code. Run it when the code is written in your editor, or before it gets into the the shared code repository. So things like that, I've seen like dramatic change just in terms of how, so the code is one piece, and then the infrastructure as well, just having constant scans run on that. I mean, it's not a secret. Capital One heavily uses AWS, and I think that's the direction a lot of banks are going to go, to be using cloud technology and cloud infrastructure, and having scans that can detect those vulnerabilities and react to those quickly is, I think, like a huge change I've seen in recent years. So I know that's not the question you really asked, but
no, I mean, but it's an interesting segue, right? Because what you're calling out is that the actual change in software development practices of companies is playing a large role in our ability to ship and deliver secure code. You know, I think this was a very salient example for many companies a few months ago with Log4j, right? I mean, Java is deployed to over 3 billion devices, I think is what they like to advertise. But I mean, it's just the expanse and the reach of Java as a code base is wild. And the expanse of common Apache libraries such as Log4j is equally as pervasive. And, you know, here comes this drop of a 0-day vulnerability that allows remote code execution for logging. I mean, it's crazy in terms of its level of impact, yet the blast radius of this was huge because everyone was using this. And I think one of the critical observations is if you actually have continuous deployment and integration of software, and you have high quality automated checks that can ensure you're not regressing with new changes, that does have a dramatic impact on your ability to respond quickly, both reactively to security as well as proactively to identifying security defects with code before it ships. But then also just, you know, even in normal operation cases where the quicker you can more iteratively get these features and changes out, the more appetite there is for, you know, raising the quality of security features and functionality in software services, because it is not a major evolutionary waterfall style undertaking to get that next thing out. So, you know, in your experience over the last few years at Capital One, how has CDCI technologies influenced the way you think about, you know, delivering code into production as well as addressing the security threat model of the services that you support?
Yeah, it's changed so dramatically. Like I remember when I started there, we basically like a lot of teams, I think, were kind of just like practically, you know, SSHing or connecting to the prod server and copying the code up there and copying it to the right location and running it. And there was a lot of like big issues that impacted the whole company that were caused by those types of changes. And it's just in terms of like the regulations and like, I mean, like in company regulations and practices and scans and all these things, that's like virtually impossible now, as it sort of should be. The flip side of that is like it's a lot more challenging to get things into production, which, you know, that friction is good in some way because there's a lot fewer prod incidents now as well. But there's so many different areas where things can go wrong. Like you just need one foothold for an attacker or one even just bug that can cause a terrible customer experience to really have quite a negative impact. So it's like it very like think a lot about, you know, asymmetric risk and being, you know, best case you make some change, you're probably going to roll out. A lot of times it's not even a new feature; it's just some small bug fix. But if things go wrong, you could either introduce a new vulnerability that wasn't there before and have millions or, you know, millions of dollars of loss, or just have a really terrible customer impact if things don't go right. So it's kind of like I think in cybersecurity in general is kind of one of those things where you're gambling to make $1 and risking to lose $1 million, with some probability on each of those. Probably just a small chance of losing $1 million, but you only need it to hit it once to come out in the red. So yeah, I think like more and more it's trending towards just more structure and scans and tools that are all built to make it really difficult to release bad code, whether that's introducing vulnerabilities or bugs as well. And I think it's trending in the right direction, but it is like it puts more effort on the software developers to really meet every single one of those checks. And it isn't as insignificant amount of time that's just spent being compliant with, this is the new enterprise mandate. Everything has to be on X version or using X scan or whatever it is. That we spend a lot of time on that sort of stuff. And I think like at a low level view, it kind of feels like, all right, this is the next scan that we're adding, or next tool that we have to use. But at a high level, I think it's really making the whole machine just a lot more secure. So sorry for my whole rant on that, but I think
I like to hear that. It's funny because I was in banking, 25 years ago, and I wasn't coding, but I did work close to that area, and we'd have one big change a year, like it just a whole different. We were on AS400 mainframe, so it's a completely different world, right?
Mm-hmm.
But banking moves so slow in those days, like innovation, because it was just hard. Innovations didn't come very quickly. And I think then as I was getting out of banking, so this probably would have been 96, 97, about when the internet started coming around. It started speeding up, but it sped up you said these words, wild, wild west. I mean, if you thought like 2010 was a wild, wild west, you should have been around 2000, 2001 in that arena. And I think it was a little too crazy, right? And we had a lot of we were just, anything could happen. And so as a customer, I like to hear that, and I know that for software developers, they hate to get slowed down, right? You just hate that. You're like, but I think it's good for the consumer for sure.
Yeah. I think there is some like I've been thinking a lot about like the good and bad friction, meaning like more and more we're like especially as a software engineer, you're kind of at a very low, like you can iterate so quickly on, unlike if you're a carpenter or something, you can build something so quickly and test it, and you kind of want that speed as well for being able to get it from your machine to whatever production server it's going to run on. And in some cases, like adding that friction a little bit just to perform those checks or get one extra set of eyes on it or whatever it is actually a good thing and not a bad thing. There's so little friction that there's not enough analysis of what's actually going on, and it's just too easy to get it from here to there. Or I guess it's just like you want those checks to be baked in, so maybe it's not so much like friction of somebody telling you have to do something, but a machine or some other tool checking it. I feel like I'm not like conveying it well, but this idea of like it's so seamless that you don't even have a chance to think about it is not always safe.
Right. I like to think of it as, speed and safety are always in conflict and in tension with one another. And that's a healthy thing if you can find the middle balance, right? Because on this one hand of the spectrum, you need to continue to deliver new features and capabilities that support your customers, as well as deliver just like the kind of quality of life, operational maintenance of software, keeping it patched, keeping it up to date. And then on the other hand, you don't want to, take one step forward and 3 steps back by pushing out a bad release that damages customer trust or causes a security incident or degrades the platform in a minute way that no one has really figured it out until 3 months later. And so putting in those, I call them guardrails, right? Putting in those guardrails into your software release process, you want to strive for automation as much as possible because humans don't scale. But at the same token, you want that automation to be like, you want to leverage that automation to do the work, right? So the actual integration testing, the actual security scanning, the vulnerability scanning, um, and adding some of those guardrails and checks that are maybe business specific to a given use case. It's, I don't think they're welcome things, right? As long as they can have some bounded expectations around what their runtime is and what their value is to you in the release cycle. But I think about this all the time, right? Like if you think about most software development organizations in the last 10 years, right? Um, when companies were doing waterfall, and I mean doing waterfall at scale, or maybe like they thought they were agile because they released once a quarter, but like they really weren't agile, right? There were kind of two camps, right? There was the one side that was like, oh, I'm a developer and I'm developing a new widget, so to speak. And then there's this other camp called QA, or integration and test, or I'm a QA engineer, right? And the two sides were just diametrically opposed in some respects. Why? Because the developers could never communicate clear acceptance criteria. So the QA team used to, come up with the acceptance criteria and then test your code. And it would be this constant back and forth kind of challenge and exercise between like, how do humans on the QA team functionally define what is considered correct code, and then how are they finding bugs and cataloging those bugs and then sending them back to development. But over time, as agile software development practices came into focus, I really think the industry, so to speak, for being a QA engineer has tremendously shrinked in the last 10 years because, again, like as these software systems get bigger, more complex, and people want more features in less time, you just can't scale humans by adding more people to the QA team and supporting a project, right? So historically, there was a ton of friction between development, QA, integration, and production because there's this army of humans standing in the way between developers and their production experience for customers. And now it's really, what types of automated guardrails and tooling are you leveraging to provide that capability? But it's fundamentally a different business optic in terms of what humans are involved. And now, where previously you were hiring QA engineers, now you're hiring DevOps and DevSecOps engineers whose job is to help the automation, help get the releases out quicker, help identify security relevant parts of your infrastructure that can be optimized. And really, the business changed very much to improving velocity with by kind of retasking humans to do something in a new and different way in the software lifecycle.
Yeah. I also have observed that like QA role, and like it's still a part of what you do, just as like writing the code. And I think like also for people that are dedicated, like, oh, you write the code, but this other person builds the or handles the like CI/CD pipeline. I think there are still people who just work on like that, getting the code from the code repository to the production server, but more and more. That is also part of the developer that writes the features as well. And I think that it's kind of the same thing with the QA engineer. That role, some of that, I think, like you said, has been automated, where there's checks and scans and things like that do part of that role. But the acceptance criteria verification and making sure that it functions the way it's supposed to semantically, that should be part of the software engineer's role, the one that's writing initially. I think that's actually like a healthy thing to have, not just be like, oh, I'm the gas and the QA team is the brakes, and they're going to find the bugs and I'm going to write them. But to be like both sides of that equation and trying to be risk averse and aware of like the potential for issues to happen and try and prevent them as early as possible before waiting. I think that's also kind of an example of like shifting left with, I guess, security, but also with bug fixes. Like try to get it as early as possible. That involves taking some responsibility when you're writing it, and even when you're defining the criteria for what's going to be written.
Jim, having heard the discussion and kind of thinking about some of the software development, products and web services, Gallup obviously has a very large web experience from the moment you hit gallup.com, the news through, the different product teams. How much of this software kind of life cycle related conversation does or doesn't resonate with what you're seeing at Gallup, and how do software developers at Gallup think about security mindset as they're developing and releasing code?
Yeah, that's a good question. I've been out of that space for a little while now.
Yeah.
I just kind of see it from the outside, and can't, like I said, I can't speak on behalf of that because I'm just not in there enough. But there is, I mean, certainly as we were thinking about, Ashton, as you're talking about QA, getting away from being a tester, so to speak, to almost being on the front end of it, of user acceptance. So like, hey, we're expecting this code to do some things, and you write to meet the test criteria as opposed to writing the code and then QA trying to figure out how to test it, right? Coming at the end from the beginning. And so, we've seen some big, I think industry wise, we've seen some shifts in that. At least that's what those are the things that I hear from folks when I talk to them about that. So it's a different, Christian, it's a different, it's a different world. Like, just like Ashton's saying, like it's a completely, in the last 5 years. And I think, and Ashton, let me ask this question: with the remote experience for you, did that change? Like, have you seen things in the last 2 years progress differently because we're working remotely? And was that a help or a hinder on some of the things you were trying to move forward on?
Yeah, I like technically or socially. I like.
Yeah, no, more technically than socially, but yeah.
Yeah, I think trying to like put it to words. I think just because of there's so much push to be connecting socially in digital spaces, there was kind of a reflection on that in terms of where like the documentation and knowledge was as well. And maybe this isn't quite what you were asking, but I think just kind of moving some of the things that were just inside of people's heads to actually be written down and documented that way. But also, I think like the whole process of that digitally interacting also led to more just digital checks and scans and bots that facilitated that, and also kind of fed into the actual writing and checking of the code. I don't know if that's what you're getting at, but
yeah, just kind of thinking through, I think we took advantage. There was, when we were all in person together and on a floor, there was some things you could do. I think conversation often replaced or was a poor replacement for actual documentation or for right, some of those kinds of things, because you're like, oh, if I got a problem, I'll just ask.
Yeah.
And then I think, and Christian, you can weigh in on this kind of as well. I think with a more disparate nature of things, with it being spread apart, you had to do it different. You kind of had to do some things differently, knowing I'm not going to get a chance to just talk to him. Now, I never took that seriously, and if I was going to talk to somebody across the hall virtually, I just call them. I'd be like, hey, you got a second? We need to talk and work through this. I'm not going to document this whole thing. So maybe I circumvented the system. But Christian, in your experience in these 2 years, did this new hybrid or whatever we're going to call it? Do you think from a software development perspective, it changed things?
I think it certainly changed the engagement model of the software development lifecycle. So when you think about like engineers all rallying at a whiteboard to solve a problem, that looks different in a hybrid work environment. When you think about how to express, kind of to Ashton's point, express concepts that need to have permanence and not be tribal knowledge. In theory, that shouldn't change. In practice, I think you get into this kind of sub mode culture where people are at their desks for longer. And that does seem to inspire more written stuff to take place. The tribal knowledge moves from verbal conversations that you're having out loud to text messages that you're having with people in instant message. And then interestingly, you know, when it's 3 months later and you're trying to remember what the heck it was you were doing and why, like now you have this memory recall just by mechanism of moving that tribal engagement into a digital form and format. In theory, you should always have, you know, high quality documentation and um, uh, design diagrams and architecture, et cetera. And, you know, that shouldn't in theory change whether you're in a pre or post COVID world. I think the reality though is that one of the main limitations to why that documentation doesn't get to the place it should is because a lot of people resonate with the speed of business matters. And so it's convenient to cut some of those corners in the short term to kind of keep pace with whatever the latest deliverable or thing is. So in some respects, I think the documentation discussion is helped by the fact that people are spending more dedicated focus time, I think, working hybrid or having the work from home capabilities. I don't know that it necessarily changed that, the collaborative aspect, other than like the way I conduct and run design reviews today is very different than pre-COVID, right? Pre-COVID, you'd have a team of engineers get into a room. Everyone would be handed a printout copy of the document. Everyone would get out their red pens. They'd spend the first 30 minutes of the meeting marking up the document, and then the second half of the meeting would be spent discussion over relevant, salient things.
Sorry, would you actually have like? Is that something you've literally done in the office?
Yeah, very very common Amazonian practice. You can read a lot online about like how Amazon does the 1-pager, the 3-pager, or the 6-pager, and how
they would literally like print it out and you would mark it up.
Yeah, most technical meetings, especially senior and principal engineers, they'd refuse to be distracted by their laptop. They'd demand a hard copy. So you used to always have to come to the meetings with pre-printed copies of your stuff, and you'd be responsible for handing them out, and red pens would be there, and then people could kind of pick and choose. But yeah, that was a lot of trees were printed on for those reviews.
Wow, that's such a non-technical
Yeah.
approach to it. I was actually thinking about this as like that. I think the whole move to remote work has also increased the desire for like quick responses to whatever it is you're trying to get, right? And that also is reflected in questions that engineers have to other engineers and teams. I've seen like more and more formal, like you fill out a form to submit a ticket versus just like talking to somebody and they'll make one for you, or a lot more we use Slack, like in Slack itself, having bots that will answer questions within specific channels about topics, and they're like a lot of times pretty good. Like they answer a lot of common questions, and I think some of those moves are good because you do get that answer, and sometimes you don't even have to ask it, because one thing I've noticed a lot more is it's a lot more conversations happen on Slack rather than in person because they kind of have to. You can't walk over and talk to somebody, and that is searchable as well, which is actually really convenient. If you talked about something even 6 months ago and you're trying to remember where was that link they sent or what is it, it's as simple as like a Control F and bring up some relevant words and you can find it. So some of those things I think are good. Like maybe the quality of the discussions that you can have in Slack is obviously not of the same quality that you'd have in person. But for basic common questions and like the lowest common denominator of, this is what the issue a lot of people face and this is how you solve it, that has gotten a lot quicker. And I think that is a result of the remote work.
Yeah. Well, I think, Ashton, you came around to the question I was asking, which is super cool, on that. And I do, yeah, I think that's a good way to summarize it. I think we've all seen those things make some changes. Some of them not great, some of them pretty great. We're all better at doing this than we used to be. This what we're doing tonight. It was pulling teeth sometimes to get people on video pre-pandemic. No. And now I'm just like, hey, flip your video on. And we're working, and I want to see them. Like I need to read body language. I want to see faces. That used to not be possible, and it's a lot better. In the role I do, that's important. I don't write any code, but I do spend a lot of time with people and getting, interviewing them, so to speak. And it's important for me to see it. Christian, any final thoughts before I put a wrap on this thing?
No, pretty interesting discussion. We went from data-driven mechanisms to software-driven mechanisms, but it's a topic we don't talk about a lot in Cyber Frontiers. Like how does software development lifecycle actually influence the security assurance of code that's developed, deployed, and used by customers? So pretty important topic.
Ashton, anything else you want to add to this on the way out? Thanks for joining us, by the way. Always great to see you. But anything else you want to
add? Sorry if I took us a little bit off the rails into
there were no rails.
Low-level, dirty details of software engineering. I'm not sure what the I guess I've kind of lost the thread on what the typical conversations are on these. But you know what? I think I thank you for having me. It's nice to get to chat with you guys again. So yeah, I had fun.
Likewise. There's no typical here on Cyber Frontiers. We just talk about basically whatever we want. I think it was a good reminder just to kind of come back to some basics for this and come back around to that, as we think about that software development life cycle in it. And, it's a different world than it was just even a couple years ago. I hear both of you saying that. Whether it was, I think we were making changes regardless. I think in some cases they were accelerated by the last couple of years. Some things were slowed down, and it is what it is, right? We've just gotten to this point, and I think sometimes it's good to take a step back and review and go, especially as we return, whatever that means, right? It's going to be different for everybody in some regards. And I think we have to ask the question, and I've been asking the teams that I work with this question: what are you going to keep? Like, what worked that you're going to keep? Because I would hate for us to have gone through this whole exercise and then like, this was great, but we can't do that anymore because we have to be. Why can't we bring some of that stuff that we learned during this time, bring it back, even if we're going to be in person, or if we're going to continue to work in a place that's hybrid? How do we continue to do and continue to do the best of it in the way that we did it? So. All good stuff. Christian, Ashton, thanks for coming on tonight and for catching up with us. I'll remind folks again, if you have any questions, you can always contact us. Jim at theaverageguy.tv. Christian is Christian at theaverageguy.tv. Not too hard to remember. Find me on Twitter at Jay Carlson. Christian, of course, is at Borg Whisper. And just a reminder, theaverageguy.tv, powered by Maple Grove Partners, gets secure, reliable, high-speed hosting. Some of the best in the business, I think. Of course, the Average Guy.tv is powered by it. Plan start. What we've been saying is fighting inflation every chance we get. $10 a month, still the same price. You can get that. MapleGrovePartners.com. And we appreciate you guys coming out and listening for the couple of you that did that as well. And if you found this for the first time or you come back to it, hopefully you're enjoying it. Christian and I would always love your input and maybe some topics that you'd love us to cover. And whether we stay on or go off the rails, we'd love to have your input. Thanks for coming out tonight if you're listening live, and thanks for listening if you're listening on the podcast. With that, we'll say goodbye.